And this is the writings of John, writing concerning the revelation of Jesus in the end times, the judgment of God on the Babylonians. And when we say Babylonians, we're speaking not of necessarily a people in the region of the desert out there by Iran, Iraq. We're talking about a system. It's a system that was birthed 1500 BC with Ur-Nammu as he discovered the process of the gold standard. And what we're seeing here is a description of Babylon. In chapter 18, verse 1, after these things I saw another angel come down from heaven. And again, God had already brought the judgment against his enemies through the seals, then through the trumpets, and then through the vials. You got 7 judgments each. There's 21. When it's all said and done, God remembers Babylon, something special in store. It goes on to describe all she has, everything that people want, and it does not fit the notion that many preachers will teach you, and that is that it is the Catholic Church or that's another form of religion. It is, in fact, a form of religion, but not one that recognizes God the way we do. So, with that, let's go ahead and jump right back into what we were doing. Now, we had just finished last week. We were reading out of None Dare Call It Conspiracy. And just to refresh your minds, if I may, the idea of this whole communist revolution being just a movement of the downtrodden deciding we want to get up, we don't like the management, we don't like the idea that workers are oppressed and it's workers that make the world go round. Management are evil people because they exploit labor, and they had these ideas that basically the worker had to overcome the management, and that everybody's supposed to get it doled out to them. Everybody should have the same. Everything should be fairly distributed by somebody. You know, this is why the rest of the world is in the state it's in. And we found out that much of what was taking place as far as the Russian Revolution taking place was all bankrolled in America. I think we just left out that the United States had put in through particular administrations, they raised the laws that basically allowed us to trade with other countries, specifically the Bolsheviks back in those days. And as long as they were non-strategic items that were being traded, it was okay. And they began to trade rubber, and they began to trade literally everything it takes to make munitions and weapons. Rubber, steel, brass, everything that it took. Couldn't sell them the explosives, but you could sell them the components. And it was the Rockefellers that basically took charge there. Certainly every loyal American will say to himself, well, I hope to God that the Soviets wouldn't walk into our defense plants and buy a patent. The Rockefellers and the Eatons have solved these problems for the communists. Instead of dealing with an official agency of the Soviet government, American concerns will be dealing with the Rockefellers. Meanwhile, 50,000 Americans died in Vietnam. Literally speaking of how many people died at the hands of this particular arrangement of politics. If you remember the trade restrictions that were lifted that allowed Russia to funnel down weapons into the Vietnamese, and at the same time we're sending troops out there to be killed. It says, meanwhile, nearly 50,000 Americans died in Vietnam, many of them killed by weapons which the Rockefellers directly or indirectly supplied to our avowed enemies. Only the technicality of the lack of formal declaration of war prevents the Rockefellers trading in blood of dead Americans from being an actionable treason. Thus, the purchase of patents for the communists, the Rockefellers are virtually in charge of research and development for the Soviet military machine, allowing the Soviets to mass produce American developments. So, one of the things that's happening too, and in fact, this is what drives me crazy when I think we closed on this last week, that, you know, remember that poor little Chinese fellow that was accused of spying for the Chinese, and they just run him through the mill? They didn't even give him due process. They just locked him up, and his whole family was fighting, saying he ain't a spy. Rockefeller gets to go to defense contracts, get blueprints, and take them to the Russians, and just give them to them. How come nobody ever says anything? The transfer of such knowledge is even more important than the sale of weapons. Well, we know that. A process that may have taken an American corporation a decade to develop is transferred in toto or totally to the communists. Does it make sense to spend $75 billion a year on national defense, then deliberately increase the war-making potential of it to the war-making potential of an avowed enemy? It does to Rockefeller and the insiders. Since the Rockefellers have contracted to arrange for patents for the Soviets, they are, by dictionary definition, communist agents. Wouldn't it be more accurate to define the communists as Rockefeller's agents? This is wild. While David runs the financial end of the Rockefeller dynasty, Nelson runs the political. Nelson would like to be president of the United States, but unfortunately for him, he is unacceptable to the vast majority of the grassroots of his own party. The next best thing to being president is controlling the president. That's nice. These guys aspire to the top. Why be president when you can control him? All right, we're going to leave that there. And we're going to go to rule by secrecy. Jim Mars. There indeed exists a wealth of documentation indicating that the Russian Revolution, indeed the very creation of communism, sprang from Western conspiracies beginning before World War I. How many learned that in school? Somehow everybody just got the idea that they're on the east, we're on the west, and they got different political ideologies, and that somehow by accident all these varying ideologies sprung up and they're the evil empire and we're the good guys. And Ronald Reagan stood so brashly and said that communism was an evil empire. He just didn't tell us who made it. Indeed, the very creation of communism sprang up from Western conspiracies beginning from before World War I. One of the greatest myths of contemporary history is that the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia was a popular uprising of the downtrodden masses against the hated ruling class of the Tsars, wrote an author, Griffin, who claimed that both in planning and funding for the revolution came from financiers in Britain and Germany and the United States. In 1917, Leon Trotsky, living in New York, was working as a reporter for the New World, a communist newspaper. Trotsky escaped from an earlier failed attempt at revolution in Russia and fled to France, where he was expelled for his revolutionary behavior. You know, France throws you out, you're in trouble. He soon discovered that there was a wealthy Wall Street bankers that were willing to finance the revolution in Russia. Now, these guys were in New York. Now, we've already read portions of this. Gary Allen noted in the Bolshevik Revolution that some of the world's richest, most powerful men financing the movement, which claims its very existence is based on the concept of stripping the wealth from men like the Rothschilds, Rockefeller, Schiffs, Warburgs, Morgans, Harrimans, and Milners. But obviously these men have no fear of international communism. It's only logical to assume that if they financed it, they don't fear it. If they don't fear it, it's because they control it. You know, when you think of communism, everybody knows what communism is. It means share the wealth. Somebody's going to divide up everybody's spoil. So if you're rich, you're going to lose it. How come these men don't fear communism? Because they run it. Now, who tells you that? That's what this book says. So he says, you believe that? We're just reading. Now, we've already read about all those foundations they started up. That's why they're tax exempt. All right. Coming on the heels of the Age of Reason, the intellectual revolt against the authority of the church, German philosophers Hegel, Johann Fichte, and Immanuel Kant inspired future generations with the modern idea that man need not to be chained to religious dogma and tradition. These iconoclasts differed only in that Kant believed that things which cannot be experienced in the material world cannot be known to man, while the metaphysical Fichte and Hegel believed that man's reason is the candle of the Lord. The intuition and love create unity of man with the divine that brings understanding and equality. Hegel's claim to the rational interpretation of the human essence, termed Hegelian system, was an attempt to reconcile opposites, to comprehend the entire universe as a systematic whole. It was a mind-boggling effort, and yet it has not been fully completed. Adherents and opponents of Hegel will continue to philosophize well into the coming millennium. It is easy to understand why such abstract thinking has been interpreted in so many ways by Hegel's followers, including Karl Marx and Hitler. Now, Hegel is the guy that came up with the whole religion or the whole notion of metaphysics. And some of you that have studied philosophy in college have been introduced to Hegel because he is probably the founder of this whole thought. And Hegel's ideas were basically, to make it simple, is that essence precede your essence. In other words, it sounds crazy, doesn't it? Essence is what you are precedes what you manifest. We're speaking metaphysically. We're talking about that which you are, not the physical you. The essence precedes your essence. So the first essence is actually TS, while the others is essence. Get it? All right. Essence precedes essence. kind of joining the spiritual with the physical. And the idea that once you comprehend this higher form of knowledge, this ether, this thing between the seen and unseen, once you comprehend that level, you figure things out. And this is what Hegel was about. He wrote the book on metaphysics. And yet people like Lenin and Hitler, they gravitated to this stuff. Who says this isn't a religion? Huh? These people aren't stupid. This isn't just blind pursuit of money. There's a belief system involved here. They hate the church. It is interesting that Fitch, who developed these ideas before Hegel, was a Freemason, almost certainly Illuminati, and certainly was promoted by the Illuminati, wrote author Sutton. It has been suggested that Hegel himself may have been a member of the revolutionary German Illuminati Lodge outlawed by the government in 1784. Though no conclusive documentation has been found, he certainly espoused the Freemason theology of rationalism. Marx turned Hegel's theoretical philosophy to the material world and developed an exceptional tool for manipulating people and events. Now, we've talked about this. Religion is always used for the purpose of manipulation. So Marx turned Hegel's theoretical philosophy to the material world and developed an exceptional tool for manipulating people and events. This had became known as the Hegelian dialectic, the process which opposes thesis and antithesis, are reconciled in compromise or synthesis. The application relevant here is that the idea of Western capitalists created communists on one side, the thesis, as perceived enemy to the democratic nations, the antithesis, the other side. The ensuing conflict produced huge markets for finance and armaments, and eventually the leveling of both sides, which is the synthesis. So they took this philosophic idea and they literally turned it into a capitalistic mathematical formula. They said, we're going to take the synthesis, and this is what's going to be the product of what you get when you form a thesis, and then you take an antithesis. So when you add these together, we're going to get synthesis. So what are we talking about? We're talking about philosophy. Now they're going to say, here's what we're going to do. We're going to build free Western capitalism here, and then we're going to add it to communism over here. And when you mix these two, we're going to get a synthesis of both of them. That's going to make us a lot of money. Isn't that wild how they're able to take philosophy that controls people, take religion that controls people, and put together a mathematical formula to make themselves rich? These people ain't stupid. Not by any means of the imagination. You know, today, there's circles everywhere. There's still even today. In fact, your most intelligent of scholars and academics, they literally attend circles where all they do is sit there and jibber-jabber the thoughts of metaphysics. They're still teaching Hegel today. They don't want to acknowledge God. They don't want to acknowledge the Holy Ghost. They want to acknowledge their essence. And all the good stuff that you literally are going to be able to produce. That's why I've often said to people, whenever you hear people talk about potential, you're dealing with humanists. You're dealing with people that don't have any idea as to what the Bible relates to man and his problem. These people always speak of potential. And you know, when you speak of potential, this is why in school today, there is no emphasis on history. Because history, how many agree? History, while we see triumph, we see more failure. And for us to continue to teach history simply limits the potential of humanity. Because as long as we see man set the bar and fail, we are constantly viewing ourselves in the light of failure. World War I should have been the war to end all wars. When people saw how many people were killed, they should have never thought of fighting it. And then what happened? World War II. World War II ends with the atomic bomb. Somebody said, well, when the atomic bomb fell, that should have showed the whole world. Don't ever mess with us again. What happened? Korea. Huh? Then Vietnam. You'd think those fools in Iraq would have figured it out. Huh? Or those Afghans. So what does that tell us? That despite these triumphs, despite our advancing, what is the human race about? It's about failure. So the idea of teaching history in school, and I'm telling you right now, that is the biggest debate taking place right now. In fact, they're winning. Most schools don't even teach history anymore. You know, on the East Coast, they don't even teach you Thomas Jefferson anymore. They don't teach you George Washington. They took down pictures of Benjamin Franklin because they said, these old white men are irrelevant. I'm not kidding you. Do you know that in school, it's not required to say the Pledge of Allegiance? You know, you ask most kids to quote the Pledge of Allegiance, they don't know it. You know why? Because they don't want you to pledge allegiance to a flag. They don't want you to pledge allegiance to a country. They don't want you to remember Thomas Jefferson. I mean, how many of you always hear Thomas Jefferson? He wrote the preamble of the Constitution. He's the one that wrote much of the Declaration of Independence, and he's the guy whose famous words are forever burned in our hearts. It says that all men are created equal. We've been endowed by our Creator with certain God-given unalienable rights. That he's convinced that God has made us all equal, and yet everybody says, yeah, but he owned slaves. Did he? Yes. So what do? You take his picture down? You stop teaching him? Why don't they want to teach these guys? Well, by teaching history, the idea is that you limit humanity. And somebody says, if you limit humanity, you'll never see the potential. It's strictly humanism. And that's what this whole notion is about. Forget God, forget history, forget everything. We're going for potential. We don't want to recognize the fact that man is incompetent, that he's a failure. Nobody wants to embrace the idea that man is incompetent. Nobody wants to embrace that. Nobody wants to deal with the idea that humanity lives in constraint. That, like God has said in his word, all men have sinned and gone astray. Nobody wants to acknowledge that because it's negative. We'll never reach our potential if all we do is teach history. We'll never reach our potential if all we do is talk about man and his limitations. How many of you know man is not going to evolve? Man will grow in intelligence. Man will grow in his enlightenment, but ain't nothing changing. This is a religion. So they turned this into a mathematical formula. The application relevant here is the idea that Western capitalists created communism on one side, the thesis. So you got communism. The West created it. We're going to make communism. On the other side, the democratic nations, the antithesis. Now, that should equal nothing good. But what they get out of it? The ensuing conflict produced huge markets and finance for armaments. Eventually a leveling of both sides, the synthesis. Can you imagine bankrolling both sides? Often during the past 50 years it was said that the U.S. was getting more like Russia and they're getting more like the U.S. I've told you that. Huh? The Iron Curtain falls, they're getting a taste of Western freedom and capitalism. They finally get to talk. Now on our side of the ocean, what's happening? You can't even say anything anymore. You can't tell a blonde joke. Huh? You can't ask a woman on a date in the workplace. Huh? You can't say nothing about all the Mexicans that are moving in. Can you? God forbid you say you don't think Halle Berry deserved the Oscar. Huh? Doesn't that drive you crazy? She wins the Oscar and she acts like, oh my God, I've opened doors. What doors does she open? Black women have been acting for years. Oh, she deserved it. Anybody see her movie? Anybody? Raise your hand in here if anybody saw her movie. Nobody. You think if the crowd was any bigger, you'd get any hands? All I'm saying is that this book ain't lying. You take the thesis, the antithesis, you get synthesis, and eventually in the end it flip-flops. It evens out and then flip-flops. In Russia, you couldn't say nothing. Now they get to talk. Now they're getting capitalism. Now they're getting free markets. In America, land of the free, you can't even talk. Huh? The members of secret societies traceable to Rhodes Round Tables understood the Hegelian dialect well. Their predecessors had successfully used it for centuries without the name Hegel. These early day Machiavellis had found but a very small step in the realization that one didn't need to wait for crisis or turmoil. Social upheaval could be created and controlled to their own benefit. Hence came the cycles of financial booms, busts, cries, revolutions, wars, threats of war, all which maintained a balance of power. Like social activists, the bureaucrats alike have learned this both ends against the middle strategy well, whether by experience, intuition, or study. Demand more than you really need, that's the thesis, from your opposition, the antithesis. And after compromise, you'll end up what you wanted in the first place. That's the synthesis. Ain't that pretty good? That's like when people say, Charles, just bid high. That's the thesis. You want something, bid high. I'm selling. I counter. I'm the antithesis. And then Charles gets what he wants. Synthesis. People learned how to work it. Returning to Trotsky, we find that he left the United States by ship on March 27, 1917, just days before America entered the war, along with nearly 300 revolutionaries and funds provided by Wall Street. Now, we already talked about how Trotsky left with millions of dollars, 20 million to be exact. Now, 20 million was a lot of money back then. Along with nearly 300 revolutionaries and funds provided by Wall Street, Trotsky, whose real name was Lev Davidovich Bronstein. That don't bother anybody? Does that sound like an African name? Does that sound like an Irishman? Leon Trotsky. As long as his name Leon Trotsky, always, oh, he's a Russian. Huh? It's kind of like Rothschild. Remember, he took the name Rothschild because it meant red shield, but what was his real name? Bauer. Is that an African name? Chinese? Where's Bauer from? Listen, I'm not telling you, to hate folk. I'm just asking you, where's Bauer from? All right, don't all sit here. This ain't Russia. What kind of name is Bauer? Huh? No. What kind of name is Bernstein? Huh? Hey. So as long as his name is Trotsky, everybody hates him because we can say he's a communist. He's a Bolshevik. Yeah. So here's his name. His name ain't Leon Trotsky. His name was Lev Davidovich Bronstein. Trotsky. It's revolutionary, man. He's one of the guys that started the whole thing there in Petrograd. He was being trailed by British agents who suspected him of working with German intelligence since his stay in pre-war Vienna. In a speech before leaving New York, Trotsky stated, "I'm going back to Russia to overthrow the provisional government and to stop the war with Germany." When the ship carrying Trotsky and his entourage stopped in Halifax, Nova Scotia, they and their funds were impounded by Canadian authorities who rightly feared a revolution in Russia might free German troops to fight Allied soldiers on the Western Front. But this well-grounded concern was overcome when President Wilson's alter ego, Colonel House, who told the chief of the British Secret Service, Sir William Wiseman, that Wilson wanted Trotsky released. On April 21st, 1917, less than a month after the United States entered the war, British Admiralty ordered the release of Trotsky, who, armed with the American passport authorized by Wilson — why would you give him an American passport? — continued on his journey to Russia and to history. After an abortive revolution in 1905, thousands of Russian activists being exiled, including Trotsky and Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, a revolutionary and intellectual who adopted the theories of Hegel, Fichte, and Ruskin to Marx and Russia's political economic predicament. After years of attempts to reform, the Tsar was forced to abdicate, March 15, 1917, following the riots in St. Petersburg, then Petrograd, believed many to have been instigated by British agents. As Trotsky traveled to Russia with an American passport and Wall Street funding, Lenin also left exile, aided by the Germans and accompanied by 150 trained revolutionaries. He was put on the infamous SEAL train. Basically, they had to get him across the war-torn European continent into Russia. You know, you can't get to Russia if you got to go through the region where World War II is being fought. So what they did was they sealed the train. They didn't want nobody to know who was in it. Because it's not only carrying these revolutionaries who are going to overturn Russia, but they're carrying millions and millions and millions of Western dollars. Everybody knows about the SEAL train. Nobody knew what was in it. It was a secret. He was put on the infamous SEAL train in Switzerland with at least $5 million. The train passed through Germany unhindered. Now, how do you pass through Germany unhindered when Hitler's trying to blow everybody up and you're running through Germany with $5 million? Huh? By the way, Max Warburg was in charge of German intelligence, and Paul Warburg was chief of the Federal Reserve in America. Doesn't that help? The train passed through Germany unhindered as arranged by Max Warburg and the German High Command. I guess so. Lenin, like Trotsky, was labeled a German agent by the governor of Alexander Kerensky, the second provisional government created following the Tsar's abdication. By November 1917, Lenin and Trotsky, backed by Western funds, had instigated a successful revolt and seized the Russian government for the Bolsheviks. But the communist grip on Russia was not secure. Internal strife between the Reds and the Whites lasted until 1922. 28 million Russian lives, many times the war lost. So again, if you understand anything about Russia and its communist revolution, more people were killed in the 20th century by communism than every war combined. Some of you don't know that. Everybody wants to be the big martyrs. Everybody hears about 6 million Jews. Everybody hears about all the different, forms of, I guess, Holocaust victims from every nation. And yet, Russia and China combined killed more human beings in the 20th century than almost all casualties combined. 28 million people, at least in this one. Author Ick saw a multidimensional aspect to funding of the Bolsheviks. The Russian revolutionaries such as Lenin and Trotsky were being used to get Russia out of the war, also to the benefit of Germany. But at the elite level, the boogeyman called the communist was being created to stimulate the division of fear and mistrust presented as communism versus capitalism versus fascism. So you got the Germans, the Italians, the Japanese, you got the fascists, and then you've got capitalists, and now you've got communists. So now you got the world all split up. Now what happens when the world's all split up and everybody don't like each other? You need to borrow money for arms. They're nice guys, aren't they? Even Lenin apparently came to understand that he was being manipulated by more powerful forces. The state does not function as we desire, he wrote. A man is at the wheel and seems to lead it, but the car does not drive in the desired direction. It moves as another force wishes. This other force were members of secret societies that were behind the birth of communism itself, the monopoly finance capitalists, as Lenin described them. Another chapter called The Rise of Communism. Many varied secret societies were involved in the movement which eventually led to communism. One of the earliest may have been the Carbonari, or the charcoal burners of Italy in the Middle Ages. According to author Akron Dario, the Carbonari claimed to have been begun in Scotland, where they lived free and communal life in the wild forest, burning wood to make charcoal. They created a government consisting of the vendite, or lodges, for administration, legislation, and judicial matters. The lodges were ruled by a high lodge and led by a grand master who headed a primitive form of masonry. Under the pretense of carrying their charcoal for sale, they introduced themselves to the villages, and they, bearing the name of real Carbonari, they easily met their supporters and communicated their mutual plans. And this is speaking of these Freemasons that were running around spreading these doctrines. One such movement was the International Workingmen's Association, better known as the First International, the direct forerunner to communism, convened in London in 1864, and soon under the leadership of Karl Marx. Karl Marx was born in 1818 in Trier, Germany, to Heinrich and Henrietta Marx, both descending from a long line of Jewish rabbis. Now, Karl Marx, everybody knows who Karl Marx is, don't you? He helped author the Communist Manifesto. Karl Marx. How many of you thought Karl Marx was a communist, a Russian? Huh? How come nobody ever tells you about these things? Now, see, this is why people get mad at Jews. This is why people hate Jews. But are these guys really Jews? These guys ain't Jews. Do Jews finance Hitler? A real Jew? These guys have a loyalty, but it isn't to Jews. It isn't to their people. And I think that's one of the most important things you have to get straight. All right? Because the temptation is for you to hate Jews. Jews hate these guys. Karl Marx, descendant from a long line of Jewish rabbis, and hence undoubtedly familiar with the mystical traditions of the Torah and the Kabbalah. To deter anti-Semitism, both Marx and his father were baptized in the evangelical established church. All right, let's take it at that. Let's say his conversion was normal. Why would it be evangelical and write the Communist Manifesto, which declares there's no God? Following his graduation from the University of Bonn, Marx entered or enrolled in the University of Berlin in 1836, where he joined a secret society called the Doctor Club, filled with devotees to Hegel and his philosophy. Although he had earlier expressed devout Christian ideals, Marx joined his Hegelians in moving from a belief that the Christian Gospels were human fantasies arising from emotional needs to outright atheism. Just humanists. Some modern conspiracy writers even claim that Marx eventually became a Satanist. They point to his eventual criticism of Hegel as not material enough in his thinking. The antisocial societies in which he moved, and a work written by Marx as a student in which he stated, "If there is something which devours, I'll leap within it. Although I bring the world to ruins, that would really be living." Again, the metaphysical views of Marx and his detractors cannot be ignored. 1843, Marx married and moved to Paris, a hotbed of socialism, extremist groups known as communists. It was in Paris that Marx befriended Friedrich Engels. He's the co-author of the Communist Manifesto. He gets to Paris, where all the fruitcakes are. Now listen, how far west is Paris from Russia? Starts out in Germany. The son of rabbis. Joins secret society while in Germany. Then he moves on to France, where all the nuts are. The enlightened. And he runs into Friedrich Engels there. He's a son of a well-to-do English textile mill owner. So Engels is what? An Englishman. He's an Englishman. He's not French, he's an Englishman. So that's further west than France, he's an Englishman. Why would an Englishman author the Communist Manifesto? Now, how many of you were under the impression that Russia was just an evil empire that rose up out of the terrible need and these in rebellion to the czars? Now remember, this stuff either happens by accident, just coincidence, it's just the way the cards fall, or it's by design. Friedrich Engels, son of a well-to-do English textile owner. Marx and Engels both became confirmed communists and collaborated in writing a number of Russian revolutionary pamphlets and books, the most famous being the 3 volumes discussing capital, Das Kapital. Ironically, it was Engels, the capitalist son, who would financially subsidize Marx, the champion of the working class, most of his life. Engels, also a devoted Hegelian, had been converted to the socialist humanism by Moses Hess, called the Communist Rabbi. Robert Owen, a utopian socialist and then spiritualist, openly hostile to traditional religion. Marx and Engels eventually moved to Brussels, that's in Belgium, and then went on to London in 1847, where they joined another secret society called the League of the Just, composed primarily of German immigrants, of whom were thought to be escaped members of the outlawed Illuminati. That means the enlightened ones. The group soon changed its name to the Communist League, and Marx, along with Engels, produced the most famous proclamation, the Communist Manifesto. So, where did this Communist Manifesto come from? Son of a rabbi and an Englishman. Didn't pop up in Russia. Didn't pop up anywhere over there behind the Iron Curtain. They decided we're going to sit down in Brussels and we're going to write it. And where'd they get their education? Germany? England? France? How many learned that in school? Marx's manifesto set forth 10 immediate steps to create an ideal communist state. They bear striking resemblance to the protocols of the learned elders of Zion, suggesting some common origin. These steps include abolition of private property. See, you can't be a communist and own property. See, this is why I tell you all the time, you gotta want land. That's where the term Lord comes from. God the Lord, I give you the land. See, in America, men don't want land because with land you have to work. Men want bread, they don't want land. Well, what is communism's first step? We don't want you to be landowners. We want you to depend on us. They don't want you to have anything because that way you can sit there with your hand out all the time depending on a system. Second thing here, progressive or graduated income tax. We already got that one. Abolition of all inheritance. Can you imagine, listen, could you imagine you pay taxes your whole life? When you die, your kids pay taxes on your life again? Huh? Confiscation of all property of dissidents and immigrants. Now, see, I don't know about you, but I mean, do you have any idea what that whole property seizure thing is with the IRS? And with, oh, he sold drugs on that. And everybody, we all hate drugs. Somebody sells a little crack out of the house, they take your house. They take your car. They take your property. Does that teach you a lesson? Does that teach anybody anything? And yet we, because we're good guys, we sit back and say, yeah, screw those people. Take it. Take it. Creation of a monopolistic central bank with a state capital to control credit. Centralization of all communication and transport. State control over factories and farm production. Well, we already got that too. State ownership of all capital. The creation of a deployable labor force. Combining agriculture with manufacturing industry and the gradual distribution of the population to blur the distinction between town and rural country. Free public education to all children. Now remember, we talked about this before. For what reason do they want to educate people? So they can brainwash you. Remember the Russians, they said, well, the Jews are excelling in everything. Best way for us to fix them is to put them through public school. Remember that? What's the best way to turn your kids thinking? Put them through school. You raise your kids as a Christian at home, and then you send them to school so that the school can tell them how foolish you are. You're sitting there telling your kid how God created the heaven and the earth. Your kid goes to school and sees that amoeba coming out of the water. Huh? And then it sprouted legs. And then it sprouted a tail. And then opposable thumbs. And then it hung from trees. Then it got hungry and needed to work his hands, so it hung from the tree from the tail. And eventually the tail became not necessary, so the tail came off, and next thing you know, come home telling you, Dad, we got to save the rainforest. Huh? It's not what I send them to school for. Dad, they're doing gill net fishing and they're killing dolphins. This is what kids learn. Dad, they're doing slash and burn in the Brazilian rainforest. And they're going to melt the polar ice caps. Anybody send their kid to school to learn that crap? By the way, what can your kid do about it anyway? Huh? They don't even vote. Why are they teaching that to kids? See, and then we as parents, we sit back and we just think, oh, that's just what they're teaching them. Don't you understand? Look, I don't mean to insult teachers, but they did studies and found out that teachers couldn't major in anything else. That they're the most gullible people on the planet. Do you know that the teaching centers in most universities are the least respected departments in all of education and all higher learning? If you say, oh, I'm pulling my teaching credential, you know what people think of you? Oh, I guess you couldn't do anything else. And then when they want to disseminate some form of propaganda, they don't go to the lawyers. They don't go to the business majors. They don't go to the theology and seminary students. You know who they go to? The teachers. Ooh, that's bad, huh? Somebody says, Daniel, do you dislike teachers? No, I don't care about teachers. I'm glad there's teachers. But why do they allow themselves to be used by this system to disseminate crap? Listen, we should all be concerned about the rainforest, but don't be telling a 7-year-old kid that couldn't do anything about it if he tried. Why do 10-year-olds write letters to George Bush? Huh? You know why? Because the teacher tells them to. Do you think a kid really understands what's happening with George Bush? Teachers get together and say, let's go write no drugs on the chain link fence with red ribbon. Does a kid even know what drugs are? Huh? That's not what they go to school for. They go to school so they can learn to read, write, and do math. And I wish teachers would just teach them that. Stick to the subjects. That's it. Free public education for all children. They're such wonderful people, aren't they? This list was so remarkably similar to the steps creating ideal society proposed by the Bavarian Illuminati, strongly indicating a close connection between the two. They're basically accusing Marx and Engels of plagiarizing. That this League of Just Men commissioned them to write this. The mass media appears unconcerned, and the public is asked to believe that this is all sheer coincidence, simply a case of the most competent man for the job. This is crazy. The report from Iron Mountain, whether provocable or historic fact, accurately reflects the thinking of the secret society members. For example, in a 1981 interview concerning overpopulation, CFR member Maxwell Taylor blithely stated, I've already written off more than 1 billion people. These people are in places like Africa, Asia, Latin America. We can't save them. The population crisis and the food supply question dictate that we should not even try. It's a waste of time. That's the way these people think. While other conflicts arguably were necessary, such as World War II, Vietnam, the Gulf War, appears less so. Yet all were immensely profitable to secret society members, and all advanced their goal of a one-world government. The Royal Institute of International Affairs and the CFR made plans for a conflict in Southeast Asia as far back as 1951. The creation of the Southeast Treaty Organization in 1954 was a calculated scheme to provide U.S. officials a legal basis for intervention in Vietnam. President Kennedy, who was assassinated before he could withdraw troops, had been increasingly at odds with secret society members on Wall Street, several of whom passed judgment on his death as members of the Warren Commission. Let's grab another book. Shadows of Power, real quick. How many like these guys? Huh? Shadows of Power, we're going to read with, this is actually, let me see, chapter 3. It's a section called the Bolshevik Connection. Remember we were reading about how the Lusitania got sunk? How they withdrew the escort boats? Churchill saying we need to find a way to involve the Americans. Nobody told you that the Lusitania was actually a munitions carrier for the Allied troops. Now, doesn't matter what side you were on. If somebody's carrying munitions to the enemy, what do you do to the boat? You sink it. Anybody tell you guys they took out full-page ads in New York telling the people don't get on it? Huh? All right, let's read. Another denominator common to many of the early CFR members was support, material or moral, for Bolsheviks in Russia. A revolution, like any other substantive undertaking, cannot succeed without financing. The 1917 Russian Revolution was no exception. It is now well known that the Germans helped Lenin, who had been exiled by the Tsar into Russia, in a sealed train carrying $5 million in gold. The Germans, of course, had their ulterior motives. Tsarist Russia was fighting them on the side of the Allies, and a successful revolution would mean one less adversary for the Germans to contend with. Less widely known was the U.S. contribution. Probably the best reference on this is Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution. This is a book by Anthony Sutton, former fellow at Stanford University's Hoover Institution. It is based on assiduous research, including deep probe into State Department files, while Sutton's focus is not on the CFR. Comparing his findings with the Council's early rosters proves revealing indeed. Just when American patronage of the Bolsheviks began is probably unknown, but an excerpt from Colonel House's prophetic Philip Drew is not a bad place to start. And this is Philip Drew. I think we've talked about him a little bit. Philip Drew in his daydreams would think, of Russia and its vastness, the ignorance and hopeless outlook of the people, and wondered when her deliverance would come. There was, he knew, a great work for someone to do in this despotic land. Leon Trotsky, living in New York at the time of Tsar Nicholas was abdicated, was able to return to Russia only because of Woodrow Wilson intervening to secure him an American passport. House cabled Wilson that any newspaper account describing Russia as a new enemy should be suppressed. Well, that's nice, isn't it? On that same day, Wilson declared that there should be no interference with the revolution, although the Bolsheviks' atrocities prevented the U.S. from officially recognizing their new government. Wilson continues to express his support for them to the shock of many people. Jacob Schiff, the head of Kuhn and Lieb Company, heavily bankrolled the revolution. This was reported by White Russian General Arsene Gulevich in his book Tsarism and the Revolution. The New York Journal of Americans stated on February 3, 1949, today is estimated, even by Jacob Schiff's grandson, that John Schiff, prominent member of the New York Society, the old man sank $20 million to the final triumph of Bolshevism in Russia. Other New York banking firms also contributed. In the summer of 1917, the city of Petrograd, the nerve center of the Russian Revolution, came one of the strangest Red Cross missions in history. It consisted of 15 Wall Street financiers, led by attorneys, the Federal Reserve Director William Boyce Thompson, plus a small contingent of doctors and nurses. The medical team, discovering that they were but a front for political activities, returned home in protest after 1 month. The businessmen remained in Petrograd. This is where they established communism. All right, this is what they did. The Wall Streeters in Petrograd, in the Petrograd Red Cross mission, founding members of the CFR, 3 others, Henry Davidson, Thomas Thatcher, Harold Swift, joined the council in subsequent years. In May 1918, Thompson helped found the American League to aid and cooperate with Russia. 3 of the group's executives, Oscar Strauss, Charles Coffin, Maurice Odin, became CFR founding members. The League's president, Frank Goodnew, entered the council in 1925. I'm not going to read that. Just tells you all the stuff they got into when they were there. Let's read out of Pawns in the Game. Oh, you'll like this one. This is William Guy Carr. Most political leaders, except communists, were also agreed that in order to free themselves of the economic sanctions imposed on the nation, it was necessary to break away from the dependence on international bankers for financial assistance in the form of interest-bearing loans. So this basically is speaking of the solutions to break free from these bankers. Everybody already knew what was going on. Some people read the writing on the wall. It has been long told how international bankers enabled Germany to secretly rearm with the aid of Stalin. In spite of restrictions imposed by the Treaty of Versailles. Now, again, World War I, remember, there was only 20 years of peace in between the Treaty of Versailles. When World War I ended, they signed that treaty imposing literally a sanction on Germany from rearming and rebuilding, and yet within 20 years they were able to do it again. All right? Now, who bankrolled them? It's been told how the international bankers enabled Germany to secretly rearm with the aid of Stalin in spite of restrictions imposed by the Treaty of Versailles. In order to understand what happened in Germany to bring Hitler to power, it's necessary to be familiar with the political intrigue which went on between 1924 and 1934. How do you think Hitler came to power, by the way? Huh? Can anybody guess? In order to understand what happened in Germany to bring Hitler to power, it's necessary to be familiar with the political intrigue which went on between 1924 and 1934. The secret powers have always had their agents to divide the population of the countries. They plan to subjugate into many religions, economic, political, social, and labor groups. Their agents then divide the various groups into many factions as possible. Their motto is, united we stand, divided they fall. Most German citizens, excepting only communists, were agreed to following issues: that Germany had been winning the war when she had first been betrayed and afterwards victimized, that the international moneylenders had used the so-called democracies of Britain, France, and the United States to defeat Germany's armed forces, that the Jewish-led Communist Party assisted the international bankers by armistice and the revolution that followed. They agreed that every patriotic German, male and female, should do his or her part and her uttermost to build up post-war Germany and break the economic and military stronghold placed on the nation by the Treaty of Versailles. So Germany, in between the wars, determines what caused this downfall was the bankers. So Germany figured this out. In other words, the German politicians, except the communists, they were agreed that Germany should depart from the practice of financing the nation's business by incurring debts, a practice which had been imposed on by England in 1694, France in 1790, United States in 1791 by international bankers. So Germany basically figured out, we're not going to do this anymore. Now, when Germany decides, we don't want to play ball like this anymore, what do you think is going to happen to Germany? Huh? What happens when you don't want to play ball with the big boys? So Germany wants out of the system. Germany figured out, hey, France is screwed. They're under the... Let's read it again. Germany wanted to depart from the practice of financing a nation's business by incurring debts. So what did Germany say? We ain't playing this anymore. We're not going to build the country by incurring debts. A practice which had been imposed upon England in 1694. Remember when the international bankers came in and took over England? Huh? France in 1790. It happened in France. The international bankers took over. The United States in 1791. So Germany says, we ain't doing this anymore. They realized that this system had resulted in astronomical national debts, the principal and interest payments on which were guaranteed and secured by direct taxation of the people. So how do you pay back these national debts? You tax the people. Germany said, I don't want nothing to do with this anymore. It makes you slave to the bankers. So Germany don't want to play. The fascist leaders in Germany decided they were going to create their own money and use their national assets, such as the value of their real estate, the industrial potentials, their agricultural production, natural resources, and the nation's capacity to produce as collateral. So they wanted their own money. You think they were going to let them have that? The people of Germany found out, generally speaking, that their views regarding future political economic policy were shared by the people of Italy, Spain, Japan, and thus became the Axis powers, the fascist movement. Because of their dynamic personalities, Hitler, Mussolini, and Franco became their chosen leaders. Those are a couple winners there, huh? History proves that these three men did a great deal to help their countries recover from the effects of the preceding wars and revolutions. The industrial agricultural developments were little short of miraculous. Their military rearmament was made possible by the secret assistance given by agentur of the Illuminati, who planned to bring the fascist and capitalistic countries into another world war. So who's financing them now? When Hitler and Mussolini first rose to power, they advocated the moderate fascist party, which demanded that the wrongs be done to their countries be rectified, that they contain communism, that they curb the powers of the Illuminati and those who control finance and industry. But as time went on, both Hitler and Mussolini came under the influence of the leaders of the hardcore Nazi warlords who claimed that to establish a permanent peace in the world was only by military conquest. The Nazi leaders sold top military leaders in Italy, Japan solidly on the theories and plans advocated by Karl Rittler in 1849. Franco in Spain refused to go along with their totalitarian plans. His religious beliefs convinced him that an ideology which denied the existence of Almighty God was doing the work of the devil. So you got to give it to Franco in Spain there. The totalitarian-minded leaders in Germany, Italy, and Japan were determined to use fascism to further their secret long-range plans in communism. Now, you ever notice that these people, they always put a religious label on these folk, but what's really at stake? What's running this whole thing? See, everybody always tells you there ain't a war out there that's not religious. Don't let people lie to you. Everybody wants to tell you that religion is the cause of wars. What's the real cause of war? Money. It's not religion. The immediate plans of the warlords were first to defeat the Stalin-controlled empire, second to wipe out communism in Europe, third to consolidate and control the Axis powers on the continental Europe, fourth to invade Britain, France, and subjugate the people, and fifth to invade and conquer the United States by using two vast pincer movements. Japan was to land invading forces on the west coast of Mexico and the south, and the Northwest Territories in the north. Germany was to invade Canada by air in the north, and German-Italian forces were to jump the Atlantic from Africa and attack the USA from the South America and the Great Gulf of Mexico. Sounds like a good plan, huh? With the conquest of Britain and the United States, the Nazis planned to exterminate the Jews living in those two countries as they exterminated the people they located in Europe. We're out of time, but refused to place themselves in the usury of international bankers. They placed themselves in exactly the same category as a small independent storekeeper in relation to the big chain store organizations and business combines and monopolies. They were given the option of joining the big happy family or else. In the case of an independent storekeeper, if he refuses to see the light, he's put out of business by systematically applied pressure of unfair competition. In the case of nations who refuse to play ball, they're doomed to suffer war or revolution. There was no mercy shown to the nations whose leaders refused to bow down and worship the feet of Mammon. There is no consideration given to the nations which refuse to place themselves in the usury of the high priest of the god of Mammon. All must pay tribute demanded of them or else. The anti-Semitic movement started in England in early 1921 after Victor E. Marsden returned from Russia, where he had been imprisoned by the Bolsheviks. Mr. Marsden had been a correspondent for Russia for the London Morning Post since 1914. So this guy's coming up with what they call anti-Semitism. We're going to leave it there. Because now we're moving into another area here. Anti-Semitism, but it's very relevant because it's going to show how these international bankers actually led up into World War II. And what we're going to have fun with is we're going to start reading how Hitler came in. And you're going to love this because... How many of you ever heard the theories of Hitler? Why he hated Jews? How many of you know his mother was a maid in the Rothschild house?